Cities are job markets. Cities are many, many things, but fundamentally, what makes everything else tick is that they are labor markets. And the advent of remote or hybrid work has made it, for some people, or I think still a pretty small minority, some people are in a sort of a national remote labor pool.
This is Manhattan Insights, a Manhattan Institute production. I'm Judge Glock, Director of Research and a Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Today, we'll be discussing housing with my guest, Salim Furth. He's a Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He got his PhD in economics at the University of Rochester, a great economics program. And to my mind, has been one of the most profound and thoughtful thinkers on housing economics out there, and also someone who's able to combine that theoretical perspective, that empirical perspective, with actual outreach into policymakers, into state and local policy makers, and really has helped get a lot of housing change implemented. Thanks so much, Salim, for coming on the show.
Thank you, Judge. It's great to see you again.
Let's start by talking a little bit about what we've learned about housing in cities since the pandemic. The pandemic was obviously a general shock to the economic system, but it caused a lot of changes in how people worked and lived, and it changed a lot of the nature of how we think about cities as well. Back in the summer of 2020, one of the top economic journals, the Journal of Economic Perspectives, had this general issue on everything we know about urban economics and how we think about housing and work. And it came out right when the pandemic hit, and basically we had to try to rethink everything. So, Salim, what do you think has changed since the pandemic, and what do you think we've learned since the pandemic about housing in cities?
Great question.
You start with a simple question. You know, everything we've learned in the past 3 or 4 years. Yeah.
I think urban economics held up really, really well, and there's been renewed interest since the pandemic because cities under stress, right? They prove sort of which theories are true and which ones are false. When you have a city that's not changing very much, you can come up with 17 different stories as to why it is the way it is. But when a city goes from one equilibrium to another equilibrium, well, then you kind of have, you know, 2 points, and you can draw a line. And a lot of other lines that would have gone through that one point, they don't go through both points. You have to be able to explain a 2019 city and a 2020 city and a 2024 city. And so I think actually urban econ held up really well. But going to your question, what did we learn? You remember the toilet paper crisis, right? So my one of my wife's friends' aunts or something, you know, went down to Walmart and filled her car with toilet paper, bought all the toilet paper she could possibly carry home right when the pandemic was breaking out. And so there were people like that who were just being like antisocial jerks, and she's probably still like using this toilet paper she bought 4 years ago, almost exactly 4 years ago. The truthfully was not that much of that, but there was a toilet paper crisis because we were spending more time at home. We were doing our figurative as well as our literal business at home. And so the rolls of TP that are manufactured for home use, we were just buying more of them. We needed, like there was real demand, not just speculative demand like my wife's friend's aunt. And the same thing was happening in housing. We started doing more of our business at home. And as people who are watching on YouTube can see, I'm in an office today. I was working from home yesterday, and you're working from home today. So we are living in a hybrid world where we want more space at home. My office at home doubles as my daughter's bedroom. She would really like to have it just be her bedroom. And that's an increase in demand for residential space. So everything we've seen in cities, we can get into the specifics, but the logic, it follows really basically from the human needs and from the way that we're spending our time and therefore our money. We're spending more time at home, so we want more square footage. We're doing more activities at home, so we want more spaces that are, quiet, so we can have a work meeting or record a podcast. We care less about being close to the office because we're not commuting every day. So those are sort of all really logical things, and then what has happened to cities follows quite naturally from that.
So I think you heard me use this joke, and I've used it too many times before, that when I used to teach and I would teach the basic econ to students. I'd tell them, if you ever fall asleep and I wake you up with a question and you didn't know what the question is, just say supply and demand as an answer and you'll probably be correct. That's obviously the situation here. We had an increase in residential demand because a lot of the work that was happening in offices is now happening at home. Residential space is now residential / office / commercial space in a way we wouldn't really have thought of it previously. You have something like 5% of the population doing work from home to more like 20 to 25%. And that is an absolutely unprecedented shock and where a large percentage of the population works. So you'd expect the prices to increase, and they certainly did, of housing. Now, the interesting thing to me, though, is one of the main justifications for cities, over the past 40, 50 years in the economic research has been it allows people to gather together in physical space. Now, that meant historically something very specific around, say, factories where you could all work together in a factory. That obviously meant things like retail where you could shop together. But in more recent times, people have really justified and explained the existence of large and expensive cities from the fact that you have a lot of people who can gather together in an office with each other. And that seemed to have clear benefits. And we all know those are benefits. You're working out of an office today. I tend to prefer to work out of an office. But what do we think we know a little more about that since the pandemic? These were being called agglomeration effects, and that we're more productive if we all work together in a single space. But if I can interview you and I'm here in Austin and you're up in the DC area, how much does that detract from those agglomeration effects? And how many of those were fictitious or just can be recreated online?
Yeah, so this is a really good question, and I think it'll take us a number of years to get to the bottom of how much the normalization of Zoom-type meetings is replacing or able to replace the in-person interactions. Some of that's going to be body language. Some of it is serendipity, right? So you're meeting people who you didn't plan to meet. And so there's these interactions that end up being helpful and productive, but you would never set up a call to have them because they weren't planned interactions. And so I think that's, there's some things that clearly we can do just as well remotely. I mean, look, for myself, I actually find it's much harder for me for my attention to be held by something on a screen, right? So if I attend an economics seminar online, I actually have to really work to pay attention in a way that if I attend one in person, I find it quite easy. It's there in front of me. It's the thing happening in the room, and I would feel like a tool to take up my phone and start tooling around on something while someone's talking in front of the room. But when I'm on my computer watching them do the same thing, it doesn't feel antisocial to start doing something else on the side. Be like, well, I can pay attention to both of these things at once. And I get less out of it. Now, the flip side is I have access to much better seminars online because it's not just the one seminar series that happens to be at my campus where my office is. It's online global seminars that I can just sign up for and hear some of the most interesting people talking about their papers. But that sort of, I don't know, personal anecdote, I think speaks to some of the ways where real physical space continues to matter. So there was a book written maybe around 2000 called The Death of Distance, and nobody blames the author. She wrote this book, and it was what everyone was thinking, right? So like, there was the dot-com boom. There's all these new technologies. You could see things like virtual meetings coming down the pike. Like they hadn't arrived, but they were clearly on their way. Everyone thought that all of a sudden distance wouldn't matter, and that we would be able to disperse ourselves and disperse production completely. And there's been some of that. I mean, it's certainly not nothing. But it's much less than advertised. And I think the strangest thing that happened is that in the first 20 years of the 21st century, all the evidence is that agglomeration effects rose, right? So it's really easy to tell the story where a factory has agglomeration effects, but apparently factory agglomeration effects were not that big. And the agglomeration effects from an information economy turned out to be quite large because it's people sharing ideas more so than people literally doing productive activities together, where a large agglomeration matters most. Obviously, for a factory, you need all the people who work in the factory have to be at the factory, but it doesn't seem to matter as much that there's another factory next door versus for people producing software or marketing or, I don't know, financial products. It seems to matter a lot that they are running into each other at lunch or something.
Yeah.
So there's 25 different stories you could tell about how agglomeration affects work, and it's really, really, really hard to sort of distinguish between the different channels that would make agglomeration work, and those channels then kind of translate into, does it matter if we're working from home? Does it matter if a lot of our stuff is online? Those are really, really good unanswered questions for the next generation of urban and labor economists.
And they can be context dependent, right? So agglomeration effects maybe can have an incredible importance in one era with one set of technologies or even in one place, and not have the same sort of effects with the different set of technologies and a different place with different sorts of businesses. So I remember hearing some talk in the 1980s and 90s even that the 1-800 number symboled the death of distance. Now that we don't have to worry about local call charges, now we can do anything anywhere we want and we don't have to worry about being close by. Obviously, that wasn't true. And it's like you pointed out, there was lots of good evidence that these positive effects of working nearby was increasing. Sort of, I think it was a paper that showed that patents tended to cite people who created new patents tend to be more likely to cite other patents from people close by in the 70s or 80s or whenever the research was done than they did earlier. They were more likely to draw on local knowledge than national or international knowledge. So we had all of this great evidence of that. And we also had, though, some of the outmigration of office work already happening in the 60s and 70s. So great writer William White did a book called The City Rediscovering the Center, talking about the outmigration of back office work. You don't need, at the time, a secretary who's retyping files to be right in the central headquarters in Midtown Manhattan. They can be outside. You can have the head office be downtown. Now, again, that seems less important. We are seeing these kind of decline in commercial real estate. And I know we're going further away from housing, which is your main focus, but we'll get back there because I think it does tie together. The decline in commercial real estate values, the office values and so much, on the order of about a third, I think, right? Is that about what we're looking at? I think some of the estimates are, does show that that seems to be representative of less value of that gathering together, which seems to have less value, therefore, for gathering in cities as a whole, because that is one of the main reasons why we buy a house in DC or in Austin as opposed to rural Montana. So do you think that's going to affect the in-migration of people and the value of housing, not just in general, which is increasing because of this increased demand for local space, but the demand for housing in these large cities versus smaller ones? Yeah.
So now we're getting to the specific consequences, right, of the pandemic, and it's really hard to unpack what's because of people's individual situations, what's because of kind of general equilibrium effects through agglomeration. We're not close to being able to unpack or distinguish between those. I think two places in America with central cities have seen a really significant decline. Manhattan, though it has largely bounced back, and San Francisco, which has not bounced back. Outside of those two quite small areas, the main thing that we've seen is what we call this is going to be terrible jargon, but like a flattening of the
you can say price gradient or rent gradient if you want to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. So flattening the rent gradient. So it means like in general, and a lot of people don't believe this, and they're like, no, the suburbs are always more expensive than the city. But if you look at like per square foot and adjusted for quality, central cities have long been much more expensive than their suburbs. And it's a little bit less so now. They're still more expensive. And the further out you go, drive till you qualify, the further you drive, the less of a price drop you get, because more people aren't commuting or are, like me, commuting occasionally. right? So actually, where I live now, I live in Maryland, I work in Virginia. That move in 2019 was premised on my boss giving me permission to work 1 day a week from home. And I said, doing this commute 5 days a week just feels like it's a little bit over the edge. Can I do it 4 days a week? And then I know there's some travel. There's days when I'm sick and I'm working from home anyway. So I knew it would kind of work out to be a little bit less than 4. And that's what enabled me to move to the community that my family wanted to move to, and turned out to be very prescient, because then I spent 2 entire years working from home. There has been less than expected shift in demand from big cities to small cities. There are booming small cities in high amenity locations, right? So the Bozeman's and maybe Cape Cod, places that people were spending their vacations before, and now are like, oh, instead of coming here for 4 weeks in the summer, I'm going to go here for 8 months or 12 months of the year. So those places have seen a boom, but it's not like we've seen a general small town boom. There was not a huge demand to live in cute towns in Pennsylvania that has suddenly, all these workers have been released from New York and DC to kind of, go live in a nice little town with a diner and 19th century street grid. That's available if you want it. There's very nice towns. Not too many people have chosen that option. Most people are staying in their own metro areas, but they're tolerating a longer commute on average by a relatively modest amount. And I think this gets us back to, and I really get into the foundations of urban economics, that cities are job markets, right? And this is a point that our friend Alain Berthaud, makes very forcefully in his book Order Without Design and elsewhere. Cities are many, many things, but fundamentally, what makes everything else tick is that they are labor markets. And the advent of remote or hybrid work has made it, for some people, or I think still a pretty small minority, some people are in a sort of a national remote labor pool, right? I have a friend who's basically he's working completely remotely and has to fly all over the country for meetings, which turns out to be really annoying. And his job market is, I can work in a job in an office in DC or for a remote company anywhere in the US, and I'm comfortable doing either of those. Relatively few people are in such a completely remote labor market. Most of us are still tied to a metro area where, even if we are remote first, there's enough meetings and times to come into the office that it would be pretty inconvenient to have to fly in, or certainly to fly in from another time zone. And you want to be, at worst 2 hours from the office, and usually within an hour. And so that gets us to, fundamentally, what is a city and why does agglomeration matter? One of the possibilities of agglomeration is that it doesn't have anything to do with our interactions on a daily basis. It's mostly about labor market. So that would be one plausible cause of agglomeration effects, is just when I want to hire a project manager in DC or a junior researcher, I have a large pool of people who understand the nonprofit research space, who know our audiences and our, the people who are kind of interfacing with and our peers, and they can get plugged in at Mercatus quickly and be up to speed. And if I was trying to hire somebody for a job like that in a cute small town in Pennsylvania, I wouldn't have people who came from that industry there. Or if I hired somebody who could be very smart and very capable, but wouldn't have the ties from a previous job or from previous interactions. And so one possibility is that agglomeration is entirely about labor markets. And I wouldn't rule that out.
I have often told people that have been advocates of the work from home will totally destroy the city argument, that say that we'll all move to these rural Pennsylvania cities, which are adorable as all get out. I'm usually talking to them in a major city, and I'm usually talking to them in a very expensive major city. And I said, well, some of them left, and I was part of the Texodus from California over to Texas. Which happened during the pandemic. It was obviously a lot of tech and other groups that moved over to this, but a lot of us moved to Austin and Dallas and Houston, which are not tiny towns and are not as cheap as we could have gotten elsewhere. So clearly there were a lot of amenities to value. And I think one of the most important was productivity, the ability to be around other people that we could share ideas with, that we could work with, we could find potential aspects of collaboration with, those kind of water cooler ideas, those happenstance occurrences that are so advantageous. But to my mind, I think for that large remote class, that purely remote class, I don't know where your friend was, but I imagine he might not have been in a tiny city. And a lot of the people I talk to that are fully remote are not in a tiny place for the second reason for cities, which I think has been underemphasized historically, and we're learning more about now, which is the amenity values. I once got a job offer to work in a very tiny town with 2 restaurants, and one of the restaurants had as a section of its menu foreign affairs, where the top choice was chicken parmesan. And not that I'm a foodie, and the second was spaghetti marinara, so spaghetti and chicken parm.
Okay.
I'm not particularly a foodie guy or anything, but I really thought about, well, if I'm going to live in a small town where once a month I have a few bucks burning a hole in my pocket, I can go down and get a fancy chicken parm at the local restaurant. I'm not sure that's the sort of life that I want, even if it's a wonderful, productive community of scholars there. And I think one of the things we've learned about cities is that amenity value of cities is very, very large. Probably larger than we expected, and for some places might be even more important than the productivity value. And that's not just gorgeous landscapes. That's the restaurants, the culture, the opera, the gatherings, the parties. And yeah, what do you think about the amenity values of cities, and how have we learned anything about that since the pandemic? As another reason beyond our friend Alain Berthaud's argument that cities have job markets. So
it's certainly real, right? And I think everybody understands that part of the reason Los Angeles is so expensive, despite having merely average wages, is that it's a really, really cool place to be. Has fantastic weather all year long. There's a lot to love about just being in LA. Same for the smaller cities along the California coast. I actually think that urbanists have overvalued amenities relative to their place and undervalued jobs, right? So you can get most of those urban amenities, not the weather, but you can get most of those in Rochester, New York, or Cleveland, certainly Chicago, right? Like if you say, I just want to be in the biggest city with all the best stuff, you can, for like a third of the price of living in New York, you can live in Chicago and have really, really high quality urban amenities. And it's just not enough to really move the needle on prices in those places. They're a little bit more expensive than kind of an equivalent wage small town in their same region. So say Control for the Weather, is it, would you rather live in Peoria or Chicago? More people want to live in Chicago, but the price difference isn't huge. And so to me, that says amenities are great, but they're not that scarce, right? So the ones that are the scarcest, right? So say like having Hawaii weather, well, you have to live in Hawaii for Hawaii weather, and it's extremely expensive to do that. So there's some amenities that are really, really scarce, and you really see incredibly high prices for those. But the things like, being around a good mix of restaurants, it's not that hard to find in America anymore. And you can get that in Philadelphia, but people are not, arbitraging the New York to Philadelphia price gradient, right? They're not all moving until the prices are equal. So to me, it's something other than just good urban amenities, which I love. And I'm really glad that those aren't too expensive, because my friend who I talked about, he and I both live really close to Silver Spring, Maryland, which is a suburb of DC that has a fantastic global restaurant scene.
In a sense, that should show up in these prices too, right? So if one of my favorite findings of urban economics is that the lower your real income, the better the local amenities should be. Meaning that if you're moving to a city where you're living in a tiny apartment, you're working for the equivalent of peanuts relative to the taxes and the cost of everything, that must mean, all else being equal, you chose to live there because all of the other benefits you get from that city are so large. And in fact, the lower your kind of income quality of life, that should be totally offset by the improved amenities in the city. I happen to think, like you, actually, a lot of those are unmeasured kind of productivity amenities, in the sense of we learn a lot in cities. And therefore, one of the things we choose kind of to get an education in cities and take a lower income, and so that we can build our income over time. And we pay for that by a lot of us in our 20s living in these tiny apartments and gaining more knowledge than we would out in a tiny town. But if you expect that these amenity values are increasingly important, you'd expect to see that those prices in Cleveland go way up and those prices in New York go down since the pandemic if the job market would sort it out. And like you said, that hasn't really happened. You've had some of the cities like, Boise that would surprisingly take off, but we haven't seen a general mass movement or a mass price increase in these cities, with kind of unrivaled cultural resources like Cleveland and Chicago and Cincinnati and so forth. Yeah.
The dark side of the sort of the Rosen Roback model that you talked about, right? So like if your amenities are great, you have to pay a lot for them, or if you're, flip it around, if you're living in a tiny studio apartment with 3 people, it must be because there's great amenities. It's sort of the grim, you get what you pay for, right? There's no free lunch. There's no way to actually, and people are always trying to do this, right, through regulation. I want to have all these great amenities, but I want to keep the community the way it was 30 years ago when the amenities weren't there or hadn't been discovered, and we were just another American town. And so you always see people sort of desperately trying to hold back the tide of rising demand, but it's going to show up in prices or it's going to show up in population. And there's no way to sort of repeal that law of gravity. Yeah.
There is, in a sense, the other way to drive down the prices is to drive down the demand by making a place unlivable. And plenty of places, Detroit and others, have discovered that so-called successful way to drive down housing prices. But like you say, you kind of get what you pay for there. And that's not a method I think most cities would want. So let's get to something that is related to this, and maybe this is all a big buildup for, I think, the thing that you and I spend a little more time working on is how to get housing prices in these large cities in America down and why they're so high. So all of this is a preface to say they're very high because we think to some extent amenities, but to a larger extent, these agglomeration effects of a job market in a large city, working together in a large city and so forth. And yet not enough supply to meet the demand for all of those people living there. Now, you've worked a lot, as have I to some extent, with the YIMBY movement, the Yes in My Backyard movement. And you've written a lot about some of their recent successes. So could you talk a little bit about how that movement has changed or grown in the last 3 years and how, I guess we can just, to give away the ghost right at the beginning, that how successful it's been relative to maybe what a lot of people thought 4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah, great question. So the YIMBY movement, I think you can trace it back to around 2012, primarily in San Francisco Bay Area. There's some people like Sonia Traus who just started showing up to local meetings where normally, right, traditionally, you get a bunch of retirees and neighborhood defenders who show up and say, hey, why are they going to build an apartment building there? They're going to cut down my favorite tree, or don't we have enough housing, or it's only going to be for yuppies. And Sonia and a few others started showing up and saying, yes, this is a great idea. We need more housing in the city. I'm a 20-something, 30-something, and still sharing an apartment with roommates. And, that's only because prices in San Francisco are so high. And so it grew from there. And I mean, what happened, and I'd say three and a half years ago, is that the price crisis spread from a handful of coastal cities to basically everywhere in America. Now, the thing about this that I think, as I consider myself a YIMBY, we have to confess is this was demand driven, right? Like all the stuff about the pandemic we've discussed, it wasn't like, St. Louis suddenly had a big negative supply shock, but St. Louis prices increased. And that was the demand shock that hit everywhere. But there's not a lot you can do about the demand shock, right? You can, try to deal with COVID, slow the spread, take your vaccine, like that. That's what you can do about the demand shock. Maybe go to the office and don't work from home. There's not a lot you can do about it. What you can do is say, well, can supply meet demand? Can we build enough housing so that at this higher level of demand, we can bring prices back down to a level where someone with a typical salary can afford a amount of housing that they consider decent and normal. And then maybe can we really go beyond getting back to 2019, which is to say the coasts are a mess, but the interior of the country has reasonably priced housing. And can we actually change the math on the coasts and in Austin and a few other cities that are sort of like cosplay coastal? And can we actually bring prices down so that far more people can afford to live there? And like I said, you get what you pay for. It's not going to be a magical pill where suddenly Los Angeles is cheap and also has the same population it has today and, no more costs. The reality is to lower the prices, you're going to bring in a lot more people, right? So you're going to build way more housing, and it's not just going to be for people who are current Angelenos. A lot of people who don't live in Los Angeles now, if a lot of new building occurred there, as there should be, would choose to move there. They'd say, I don't want to live in Riverside or Phoenix, where the weather's terrible. I want to live in Los Angeles, where the weather's great. And, hopefully, by building a lot and using tax revenue in wise ways, Los Angeles can be a city that a lot more people live in than currently without driving down those amenity values too quickly, right? So there's different ways to deal with growth in terms of traffic congestion and pollution and things like that. And if you do it poorly, as say Los Angeles did in the 60s, then you end up with very quickly sort of pushing down that amenity curve and saying, we're gonna stop growth by lowering amenities. And if instead you say, no, we're going to keep growth going by making it less costly, you don't end up, saying just getting to some other happy equilibrium where you never change, but you're able to hopefully give a lot more people access to an improved life and keep those costs under control.
Yeah, so that's to my mind one of the kind of another counterintuitive finding or idea in the urban economics. In a sense, the main beneficiaries of increased housing supply in these big cities will be the whole nation, not the residents of those cities themselves, in the sense of, if that model that we talked about earlier is true, in the sense of if an area has cheaper housing, and therefore you can pay people less, you have more people moving in, the wages will go down, the price will equalize, and your kind of quality of life in that city will be about the same as before the housing influx happened, when everything evens out. In the meantime, of course, there can be a lot of changes. But the nation as a whole will have a lot more people in productive areas. They'll have more options on where to go to, more potential productivity from those areas. And therefore, it will be a national benefit. But as you point out, most of the kind of advocacy on this has been in a few large urban areas, originally around the Bay Area, moving into the rest of California, which is kind of sui generis in terms of its prices relative to the rest of the country, and then definitely across a large chunk of the urban areas in the after the pandemic. Now, to my mind, I've been an advocate of a lot more building out versus just building up. Now, the YIMBY movement has been almost solely focused on densifying, as in terms of increased apartment complexes, smaller lots in large urban areas, and has been less focused on greenfield development, building further away from the urban centers. What are your thoughts about those two aspects of building and how those can affect housing prices in these big cities where you have the biggest, the highest housing prices and rent prices?
Great. So those are great questions. I actually want to go back to the first part of your statement there, which is and maybe I'm contradicting myself. So here's a galaxy brain econ theory take on who benefits from lower prices. So in a sort of simple model, you say, well, actually, it's there's some benefit created by Los Angeles being more affordable, but that's actually spread over the whole country because everyone's just kind of equalizing. But if we add complexity to the model here by saying, well, actually, different people have different local ties, right? So my family lives in Boston and Rochester, and so I care about being in those places. much more than other people would care about being in those places. And so I would benefit more from those places being affordable than you would. People who live in a place are usually the ones who have local ties there, right? So most of the people with local ties to Los Angeles already live in Los Angeles. Those folks, they're going to kind of like pay above, they'd be willing to pay much more than market rate to live there. And in some sense, they have this large consumer surplus that higher prices can just sort of eat into their consumer surplus, right? So the person who's kind of footloose and coming out of college and, they've got family everywhere and like, I don't know where I want to live. They might get attracted to Los Angeles because these amenities are great, and they choose to move there. They're the ones driving up the price. And there's some sort of logic to the NIMBY actually argument, right? Of like, these newcomers, they don't love this place as much as I do, right? And so in an economics point of view, we'd say their consumer surplus is lower, but they're driving up the price because they have so few ties that there's nowhere they want to be, or there's nowhere that they can get a job, which gives them, this equivalently large consumer surplus greater than the market. And so you get these non-marginal people who are actually gaining and losing the most. It's the marginal people who don't gain much. So once you have a model with a lot of non-marginal consumers, you get interesting things. But no, okay.
I know that's great. I'll have to think about that, but I think you're right. But I want to come up with a contradiction, but I can't think of one at the moment. So I'll declare you correct on that argument about the beneficiaries of upzoning. But anyway, to the issue of also where to grow. And that maybe contradicts what I said earlier. Maybe you can get more than what you pay for, right? So I said you get what you pay for. That's if you're marginal. If you're non-marginal, exactly. And we were saying I was saying part of the benefits of upzoning is increased choice, which is not going to be reflected in the prices necessarily of what people pay, but it's a better matching system. You can match better nationally if you have these lower prices everywhere, which even, hey, if your income to rent ratio looks pretty similar, hey, you're in a place you would actually prefer, and that doesn't show up in the stats, but it's something that you definitely are a beneficiary of. So, yeah.
All right, so back to YIMBYism. So you're absolutely right. YIMBYism it's above all, it is a movement, right? It's like a group of people who care about working on this issue together. You and I are from right of center, but the majority of YIMBYs are left, often far left, because they, are drawn from, the young renters of the San Francisco Bay Area, New York, and, a handful of other really expensive coastal metros, right? That's not because of the nature of the policy, it's because of the nature of the problem, right? These are the folks who are suffering most at the margin from high rents. I have some sympathy for like the kind of old school tenant activists who are like, hey, over here in our poor minority communities where we got, deal with lead paint problems and slumlords and urban renewal, and we've been fighting this battle for 75 years and you all just showed up. I think YIMBYs are smart enough and self-aware enough to know, hey, if it's bad for me with my professional 9-to-5 white-collar job, it's really bad for people who are further down the ladder. So I don't think... the criticism that YIMBYs don't care about these other people is I think, mistaken. They do care. They understand that they are middle class and that if they are getting hurt, people much below them are getting hurt. But they're also high-capacity people with time on their hands. Most of them don't have kids. They're able to show up, do activism, blah, blah, blah. The stuff that they want, right? Where they are living and where they want to buy is dense, older places with a lot of character. They really want to be able to access a specific set of urban amenities. And so there's a natural focus on we're solving a problem for this group of people who are the movement, and they're focused on that area. Then there's also ideological, kind of an overlay on that where sprawl is more implicated in climate change and emissions. It's more tied up than kind of old urban fabrics with white flight and racism. There's a bunch of kind of ideological commitments on the left where greenfield growth looks worse. For myself, I celebrate Houston, right, as a kind of one of the kind of great global YIMBY cities. Tokyo would kind of be the other one that I'd put in that conversation of like, these are the cities that we have the most to learn from. They're both cities that have grown enormously on their peripheries and continue to grow on their peripheries, even as they densify and develop in the center. And, again, going to urban economics, if you take an off-the-shelf model with reasonable parameters and say, here's a model city, now we're going to throw a lot of demand at it and see what happens to supply. And the answer is most of that demand will be met by horizontal growth, and a relatively modest share will be met by densification at all points in the city.
Yeah, and so obviously you've seen they've had Houston and Dallas and all of these others have seen some amount of densification, but their overall density, as with much of the United States, keeps declining. In fact, as I've pointed out to some of the more extreme YIMBYs who only focus on the center cities, the only cities that have really densified in the U.S. in the past 30 or 40 years are California cities. They are the cities that have seen increases in their metropolitan density to around 6,000, 7,000 people per square mile. Now, that doesn't mean, as some anti-YIMBYs say, density is correlated with higher prices. No, that's because there's demand to move into those places, and it's only to some extent being met upwards. So given that fact, I mean, do you think a lot of the YIMBY activism is maybe misdirected? Not that it's not useful to have this increased density in these cities, but if we look at where the successful low-price cities that are attracting more migrants are, they are these outward-growing cities, these that are allowing more greenfield and horizontal development, and that seems to be meeting versus the demand versus the cities that are really densifying.
So first, just a note on density. So I think there's two concepts of density which are really important to distinguish when we're talking about this. One is population density, which the numbers you were talking about were all population density. The other is the built density, right? So cities like Houston, they're not increasing their population density on average, but the intensity of construction is increasing a lot. And that's just going against the headwinds of shrinking household size, right? Which is accelerating post-pandemic because we want more space for each person in the home when the workers in the home are not spending 8 hours a day out. So I think it's really important, if you want to have a healthy central city, it needs to be adding residential space, not just staying the same. Even if nobody new was moving in there, right? We are consuming more space per person. We have smaller households. We're living longer.
And this is accelerated.
To accommodate that.
Yeah, this is accelerated during the pandemic, where you've seen the decreasing size of the household, the increasing square footage of the average house. So even, in an existing urban area, if you didn't build a single square foot, you'd expect to see decreasing population just because everyone is using up a little more space. So you do need to build more even to make up for that, to keep a population stable in these areas. So exactly. Thank you for clarifying that.
So I'll defend YIMBYs here a little bit. There's a few areas in the country where there's legitimate opportunity for horizontal growth that is blocked by regulation. So Portland, Oregon, Seattle are certainly among those. But say if you go to Los Angeles, which to me the poster child for a city that would benefit from regulatory change, you can quite easily buy a house lot and build a house on the fringe of the city in Lancaster or Palmdale. But you're in the fringe of the Mojave Desert. You're far from the amenities. You're not in the Los Angeles that people want to live in. And Los Angeles has basically done horizontal growth until it has reached mountains and desert. So San Bernardino and that entire region is one enormous sprawling suburb with all the pros and cons that come with that. If you're at the edge of that, you're not really integrated into that labor market, and you're not getting the weather or the beaches. So it's sort of at some point, there's just no demand, and I think we should let people build there. And you can. I mean, if you want to move to the Los Angeles metro area, you can move to Victorville tomorrow and buy a very cheap house lot and build your own house. That is perfectly legal, and no one's doing it. I bet so. I made this comment once, and was somebody like, "Oh yeah, my family lost a lot of money out there." Yeah, no kidding. Nobody wants to live there. Then you get some cities where horizontal growth is happening apace, and I think one reason that we don't need a lot of YIMBYism in suburban Texas or suburban Atlanta is you can build there, right? Like it's again, There's growth happening. It's legal. There's ways to improve it, and actually think, marginally densifying the horizontal growth is actually that's where you're going to really create value, right? Because if you can fit 20 families per acre instead of 6 families per acre at the edge of the Austin metro area, that means you're consuming, a third as much land. You're giving people significantly shorter commutes, and you're building communities that are going to actually be able to economically support themselves. Right? It'll make sense for employers to locate near there. So I wrote I think there was just a Twitter thread on this, but I had a lot of fun with it. Is there any reason that Dallas will stop growing? Right? So if you look at a big enough metro area, the metroplex is very like Los Angeles, the jobs are very diffuse. They're everywhere. They're not in the center. So it's not like everyone commutes to the center city like DC or New York. And even there, it's not everyone, but it's still a significant portion. Being near downtown Dallas is not that big of a deal compared to being near any of the other job centers. And the density as it's grown has been quite high. It's not like East Coast cities. So if you look at Atlanta or Boston, then you have a really serious problem of the outer suburbs are much too low density to support urban growth. They're very low density suburbs. And so the city's kind of gravity is never going to move out of the city, which means that if you build at the fringe of Atlanta or Boston, those people have to drive a long way because the amenities, the things that are making Atlanta and Boston, those are in the core of a relatively compact area compared to these enormous, very low density sprawl areas that surround it. That's not what's happening in Dallas. In Dallas, it's like high density suburbia with mixed in office buildings and multifamily buildings and lots of shopping, and then like half a mile later, it's cows. And then like they evict the cows and they build more city, and it's basically city. And there's no real reason that it should stop until it reaches the Canadian border. Jobs just keep moving to North Dallas. And so if you move to if you're the last house in like Denton right now, you probably don't want to be commuting to downtown Dallas, but there's lots of places you can commute to. The logic that brings you to that last house in Denton, and I assure you someone is buying that last house in Denton right now, and very happily and probably paying $450,000 for it. The logic that brings you there will stay exactly the same logic for the next house. It won't weaken. In Boston, it weakens because you move one house further out. The city's not growing with you. You're just getting further away, and at some point, it's not worth it. But in Dallas, the whole city is growing. The jobs, the manufacturing, the retail, it's all kind of growing, mostly northward. And that logic, as long as they keep building densely and keep having suburbs that want to be major cities and that build, big jobs hubs, that'll never stop. And so, watch out, Saskatchewan.
Yeah, I appreciated that, and I think I had read that thread you had written. Again, some people who were arguing that, a lot of these sprawling areas, Nashville, Dallas, Oklahoma City, we're going to come up to, quote unquote, the limits of sprawl. There's something was going to happen that it's going to have to stop because exactly they're too far out. The infrastructure is too stretched, whatever. But as you say, this is kind of modular at this point in many of these places. This can be repeated ad infinitum off as far as the city can go, and it seems to be pretty successful.
Great. So we've talked about a few different kinds of cities, right? So you get the West Coast ones that are up against their mountains and you can build, but you don't want to build on the fringe. You've got the Sunbelt ones that are building on the fringe. And then you've got the East Coast cities where, these places were fairly densely settled as farmland for hundreds of years. And so there's small towns everywhere. So there isn't a fringe that's as well defined. And I would say actually in those places, the YIMBYs are absolutely supporting policies that allow suburban growth. And now it's not at the very edge because the very edge might be 50 or 60 miles from the city and kind of useless. But if you look at, say, in Massachusetts, the MBTA Communities Law, which is the principal YIMBY victory there, it does not apply to the city of Boston. And it does apply to 100 small towns and big towns in eastern Massachusetts, all of which is supposed to find a little bit more space for housing. Not a transformational law, but I actually think one of the funny things about YIMBYism is that you get a lot of people who talk about high density and that, they really like to have apartment towers in more places and really love the central city. But the policy wins have mostly been around things like accessory dwelling units, duplexes, smaller lot single family homes, which are really only transformational and meaningful in suburban contexts. And, the real question of, are you going to move land from conservation in the Northeast to housing, that's harder. But when you're talking about, it's towns that are settled at mostly 1 to 2 acre lots, YIMBYs are absolutely working to allow people to subdivide those lots into regular suburbia. So I actually think it's sort of funny where the what YIMBYs talk about and what YIMBYs accomplish ends up being quite different.
Yeah, and I think it's important because both YIMBYs and the general population sort of overestimate the part of our population that lives in what we think of as dense urban areas, which is, 3-4 story apartment complexes, which is places with, large transit systems. Staten Island, as I pointed out, is actually very dense. It's in some sense one of the denser places in the entire United States, but it looks like what we think of as suburbia. But a lot of what the YIMBY movement is doing in practice is exactly making places look more like Staten Island, not necessarily like uptown Manhattan or Brooklyn or something else, because that allows that increased density and meets that demand for a lot of the single family housing, et cetera, that people want. Now, I'd also
that's a take that will make nobody happy.
No, exactly. But there you go. I'll also say that I've often heard the argument, and former Bay Area resident, that, you can't build outwards there because the hills. And I was living in San Francisco at the time, and I'm looking around me saying, wait a second, I think this city might have been built entirely on hills. And so it is possible if you want to do it. But there is some combination of demand and weird things like slope density ordinances that is preventing that sort of outward growth. But as I've often said, there's definitely the need for both up and out. Now, I think 2 kind of final questions I think be worth finishing off here. One is, how much do you think this movement, and as you noted, a lot of it is very new, outside of California especially, is going to actually have on prices? There's some argument, and I've made it occasionally, that the effect both on prices and on actual building is pretty minimal, at least in California, where we've seen the longest term aspect of this. You've seen an incredible increase in these accessory dwelling units, granny flats. We've never come up with a good name for them, but there you go. These kind of little out parcels you put on your property and try to get someone else to live on, a family member or a renter. And that's increased to around, whatever it is, 20,000 a year produced in California from basically nothing. That's a huge benefit.
Right.
But you have not seen in all of these places that have enacted the YIMBY laws a lot of change in the near term. So what do you think about the prospects for that changing? Or what do you think, even if we're on the same page about we do obviously need this increased density, but the laws themselves aren't seeming to create it, what would need to shift to make sure that's having a more powerful effect?
So California has passed a lot of YIMBY laws, but it usually ends up kind of shooting them in the foot with labor provision. So there's one where you're allowed to build, or a church is allowed to build housing on church land or a college on college land, but only if a qualified developer does the building and pays union wages. And it's like this is ridiculous. A qualified developer? Like we're really judging not just like can you build housing, but who can do it. So when you have rules like that attend every one of your laws, it's not surprising that ADUs, which are the one thing that they just sort of say like, well, we know this is only being done by homeowners, and small contractors. We can't put a lot of requirements on it. It's no surprise that's the one that's having an effect. If you look at significant reforms in other places, like say Houston's minimum lot size reform from 1999, that had a major impact on production. So it's not that land use reforms can't have an impact. I think that a really important question for YIMBY researchers going forward is, can state reforms have an impact when cities don't necessarily want to go along with it? Or are they always going to find a way, the city's always going to find a way to kind of block the effectiveness? That's an important possibility and one that we have to be alive to. So I think maybe relative, I do a lot of work with state legislatures, but maybe relative to some of my YIMBY friends, I think that cities are more important in the long run, because they actually have to write the permits. They have to want to, right? So we can't win and change America and bring down housing prices by like tricking a few people, into signing some laws that will change some technicality, right? It's not that kind of a fight like I don't know if you're like some industry that's trying to get a little payout secretly. It's more, can we change hearts and minds so that everybody says, oh yeah, building more housing in my community will be great. Like it's going to be a better place when we have some new housing, because that'll add more residents, which means more jobs and more stores and more options than chicken parm, and then we all win, and my kids will be able to live here, right? So when you change hearts and minds, which has been done before in this space, right? The reason that we have a neighborhood defender class of people who came of age in the 60s and 70s is that was in the air at the time, was communities shouldn't be changed against their will, right? That was a huge value that those folks grew up with, and now they're using it, I think, in some negative ways. A younger generation is coming in with a new set of ideas, and I think if you win that war for ideas, then all the little policy stuff will follow, and you really will get effects. It's not magic. It's not going to make everyone's housing free. It's not going to make everyone 2 inches taller. But I think it can, in the long run, make housing prices something that fewer people have to worry about, and that's the goal.
Yeah. And as I think, I've written a bit about this, where I agree with you. The state laws have a lot of extra work to do if there isn't the local buy-in, and therefore I've been more of a fan of the YIMBY-ish laws that have been passed at the local level. But how much of this do you think then is kind of a false consciousness, where you say you need to make the rhetorical argument for this versus something systematically is wrong? I've focused a lot more on, the local incentives for growth fiscally, in terms of infrastructure, are not as good in some places and others, and therefore you don't get the local buy-in, and no amount of rhetorical change is going to change that. I guess, as the econ guys, you and I are probably more suspicious of the rhetorical change argument than there has to be some financial reason that NIMBYs are fighting this, even if, like you and I think, agree that on the whole, upzoning should increase the value of their property because they can sell and densify and do these other things to it. So to finish this off, there are other ways to get that local buy-in besides just hortatory yelling at the NIMBYs? Because I do worry sometimes YIMBYs think that NIMBYs are just confused, and if they tell them loudly enough that they're wrong, that they'll get the idea. When I'm imagining they're probably the best judges of their own interest, even if their own interest isn't necessarily a societal interest.
So I'm somewhat skeptical of people maximizing their property value. I don't think that's the motive for people who are deeply engaged. Now, if you're going to destroy someone's property value completely, right? If somebody's going to put a Walmart right next to your house, and you're like, wow, no one's going to buy this from me. Then that person's going to be really motivated. But you go 3 houses away from the Walmart, and the effect is like 5%. It's just not that big. I think that the people who really matter from the institutional design perspective are the city officials, right? They've got to balance a budget every year. And if new development makes it harder for them to balance the budget, they're going to find all sorts of excuses to say no to new development. And if, as in Texas, new development makes it easier for them to balance the budget, they're going to find all kinds of excuses to approve it. And I think getting that level of fiscal incentive right is sort of within states' power, and there's so much variation across the U.S. It's clearly it's not fundamentally always good or always bad. Making sure that those sort of taxing systems and impact fee systems are set up correctly, that's really important to not have institutional drag. I think the ideological, with regular people and the people who are choosing to be engaged, people who are choosing to spend their Tuesday night at a planning board meeting, there has to be something more than a couple bucks that's getting them out there again and again. And, that's my view. I hold that weekly. I'm sort of willing to have my mind changed by research on that. We know actually relatively little about what motivates people to show up and who shows up. But I'm strongly believe in the institutional incentives, and I think that's something that we can do a lot more work on.
Our guest today has been Salim Furth of the Mercatus Center. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Judge.
Once again, I'm Judge Glock, and thank you for listening to today's episode of Manhattan Insights. If you like what you've heard on the podcast, please hit the subscribe button and feel free to leave a rating on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever you might listen.